We are live. Welcome to the podcast. Most people don't, but you do. We have stories and conversations about people that are exceptional, people that are doing unique things, people that are learning. Today's guest represents all of those values and characteristics. It's my pleasure to welcome Chris White to the podcast. Welcome, Chris.
Bart, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
We had a conversation, gosh, it was several months ago, and I was just learning the most amazing things about Chris. I'll read a little bit about his bio, but we want to get into some questions here momentarily. Chris White is the author of the Amazon bestseller, The 6 Habits of Highly Effective Sales Engineers. He is the co-founder of Tech Sales Mastery and host of the LinkedIn Live program called TechSalesAdvisors. After spending 15 years as an IT professional, he moved into a technical selling role, and he discovered very quickly that he didn't know anything about sales. So he turned that experience into the book that he published in 2019, and he now teaches other high-tech professionals how to make the transition into the rewarding profession of technical sales. Boy, that's a mouthful, and what an interesting story, Chris.
It is a mouthful. Hearing you say it makes me, scratch my head a little bit. Did I actually do some of that? But yeah, it's been an incredible journey, Bart. And it's, sometimes I have to pinch myself. I wake up every day being very satisfied in what I'm doing, and sometimes surprised by what I've done. So yeah, it's been a fun ride.
Yeah, well, congratulations on all of your success. And I wanted to start this way. We're going to go backwards here in a moment, but for our listeners, and this will go out to, again, over 100,000 people, and very fortunate to be successful like you, a lot of followers, a lot of listeners. And recently we were awarded the top 2% of podcasts in the world. Incredible. It's thanks to guests like you that are helping to share and teach us. I want to start off, Chris, for our listeners, because they come from all different backgrounds in all different industries. And I asked you this question as well. I said, well, what is a tech sales advisor? What is a sales engineer? What is a sales tech person? Can you kind of explain that first? And then we will go backwards to learn more about you as an individual, but let's start there.
100%. So the easiest way to explain it is this. If any of you have ever been involved in purchasing software, if within the organization that you work with, if you've ever been involved in purchasing software, more than likely you attended a meeting with a couple members of the team from that selling team from the vendor, and there was probably a sales professional, AKA account executive, man, woman, what have you, who gave some sort of presentation, and then he or she invited a colleague to demonstrate the product. And that individual was probably an expert in the field, an expert in the technology. They explained how the product worked. They answered technical questions. That is the sales engineer. That's the individual who has a technical background, a technical expertise, but they are responsible for this technical side of the sale. That's what we refer to as sales engineers.
Yeah, and whenever you explain that to me, Chris, I was familiar with what that role, not the term, but I was familiar certainly with what that role did. And I gave the example years ago when 10 years with Hyatt Hotels, and then I went to work for a company called Starsight. And it was essentially an online platform, cloud-based, that was connecting meeting planners with suppliers, with hoteliers. And when I would do the presentation to the hotel company, I brought along a friend. His name was Bob Bennett, and he was the smartest gentleman around. In realizing what he was doing is he was sharing the technical depth of the things that I did not necessarily understand. I could talk about the sales lens and the sales perspective, but if a customer wanted to understand the technical part, that's what my friend Bob was there for. Did I explain it well from my interpretation?
You nailed it. Yeah, okay. That's exactly the role. And here's the interesting thing. For those of us in this role, we consider this the best job in tech. Why? Because there's a number of aspects about selling that people don't like, right? Prospecting, knocking on doors, facing rejection, right? And then when you do find someone who might be interested in the solution, we get to sort of parachute in and be the expert. We explain, we demonstrate, we answer questions. But then what's the other part of sales that people typically don't like? It's the negotiation. It's navigating the procurement side. It's getting this the signature on the dotted line. We're not involved typically in the front end. We're not involved we're sort of right in the middle, what we like to call the middle of the funnel, which frankly is the fun part of sales. And we continually do that. So yeah, it's sort of, and a lot of people, when they do discover sales engineering, had never heard of the role before. A lot of people sort of stumble into it. And for those people with the right mix of technical or sort of industry expertise and people skills and presentation skills, and then sales skills, there's no better profession.
Yeah. And I love that you said that, Chris, because I'm just thinking of a few people that I know that are at different stages of their career. That they might necessarily like, just give you a quick example, someone in hospitality for 30 some years, and they don't like selling anymore. They don't like the pressure. They don't like the quota. They don't like the goal, yet they're very, very good at what they do. So perhaps becoming a sales engineer without the pressure of closing, without the pressure of signing on the dotted line, without the pressure of prospecting and hunting and gathering, could that be a good opportunity for people?
100%, particularly if it's someone in the hospitality industry.
Yes.
There are countless software companies that sell to the hospitality industry.
Yes.
So they could enter this profession as an expert in the industry, but rather than, to your point, the hard sell, the prospecting, some of the, what really is a grind in sales, they show up, they explain, they demonstrate, they answer questions, and then they move on to the next one. So,
okay.
Yeah.
For our listeners that are in the person that I'm specifically referencing, hopefully you're listening to this right now, or you will listen to the replay. Right now it's being broadcast live, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook, and then it will go through the distribution of Spotify and Apple Podcasts. But I hope they're listening, Chris, because it's a really interesting approach. And I'm so glad I even started asking that question. I just got back from a conference last week called High Tech, and it's in Charlotte, North Carolina, phenomenal group. And it's part of HFTP, Hospitality, Financial, and Technology Professionals. Essentially, it is people that are providing technology solutions to the hospitality industry. So you just nailed it right there. If someone is looking to get out of sales and they are a little bit more than customer relationship or customer experience, this could be a phenomenal start. So thank you for that.
Or if I may, if they're in operations and they think they might want to get into sales, but they have sort of a negative attitude, like, I don't want to prospect and I don't have to be closing, right? So not only someone who's tired of selling, but someone who's not in sales, but think they might want to be more in a people-facing role, it's another sort of softer way to enter sales.
Yeah, it's so smart. And what brilliant solutions already. Chris, I like our listeners and our listeners like to learn about the individual. Yes, we know that you're wildly successful for what you're doing right now with Sales Tech Advisors, TechSalesAdvisors CEO, started several companies. Can you tell us about growing up and what did you think you wanted to do for a living?
So for the first 18 years of my life, I'm pretty sure I wanted to be a professional water skier. That didn't work out so well, although I do spend some time behind a boat. I went to school thinking I was going to be an engineer, and I switched my degree to computer information systems for one reason and one reason only. It was the only thing it was the only degree that I was actually going to get through college studying. So I graduated from university in 1991, got my first job with a company called Freddie Mac, which at the time nobody had ever heard of, as a software engineer, programmer, developer. I did that for about 15 years. And, Bart, it's funny. I became a consultant about 5 years in, an IT consultant about 5 years into that part of my profession, my career. And within about 10 years or about 15 years into my career, I was making more money than I thought I'd ever make, doing exactly what I thought I wanted to do, which was IT architecture and enterprise architecture and data architecture. And I was miserable in my job. And I thought there was something wrong with me. I was a consultant and I was always looking for the next the next project, the next job. And I found a career counselor, in essence, a professional career counselor. And I went through his program, and he said, Chris, there's nothing wrong with you. You just have a number of skills and talents that need an outlet. And so I discovered this role, pre-sales, sales engineers, as we refer to it. And as I like to say, Bart, I thought I was going to be brilliant because I could move a mouse and talk at the same time. and I found out very quickly that I didn't know anything about selling. And in fact, the first time I heard the words sales and process used in the same sentence, I had no idea what they were talking about. What do you mean there's a process? In fact, I was just thumbing through your book a moment ago, and somewhere in here you have most people don't apply a process to sales. I had no idea that there was a process to sales. And Bart, I'm here to tell you, I made a lot of mistakes when I first got into this profession, but I figured things out and became the number one sales engineer in my team. Did that for 5 years, moved into management. That was in 2010. And discovered that the team that I had inherited were making many of the same mistakes that I made when I first got into the profession. And there was not a lot of training at the time, some, but not much. So I created a training program for my team, which really turned the team around. In fact, to the extent where the CEO came to me and he said, what have you done with this team? We started closing some of the biggest deals this company had ever seen. And fast forward about 8 or 9 years, over the years, I had been giving this or a version of that training to a number of different teams. And along the way, I had a number of people say to me, have you ever thought about doing this professionally? Like, you would be really, and have you ever thought about writing a book? Mm-hmm. And what's interesting, Bart, is I tried to publish a book, or I tried to write the book, probably on and off over 2 or 3 years, with zero success. And I had given up. I thought, you know what, it's just never going to happen. And I somehow found a publishing coach. By the way, are you starting to see a pattern here? I found a publishing coach. I wrote him a big fat check because he said to me, Chris, if you do everything I tell you to do, when I tell you to do it, your book will be published as an Amazon #1 bestseller in 2 months or less.
Wow.
Now, I wasn't sure I believed him, but I desperately wanted to. I hired him on April 22nd, 2019. The book was published as an Amazon #1 best-selling new release on June 21st, 2019, literally 1 day short of 2 months after I hired him.
Incredible.
And it was an incredible experience. And interestingly enough, at the time, I still had, quote, a day job, but about 5 months later, some guys that run onboarding for Salesforce, pretty well-known company in the CRM space, reached out to me on LinkedIn and said, hey, we discovered your book. We love it. It's going to become required reading for all of our new hires going through our program. And oh, by the way, can you ship us 200 books? It was at that point that I decided, maybe I've done something worth doing here. Right. And here's where my story turns a little bit interesting. I launched the business in March of 2020. So do the math on that. Like literally weeks before the world shut down.
Yes.
I took my last paycheck and went out on my own, managed to survive 2020, and the business has really taken off since then. And here we are. I've been doing this full time now over 4 years. So let me come up for air for just a moment. That was a long-winded monologue.
No. And this is exactly what we wanted to discuss. Learn a little bit about the industry, but most importantly, learn more about Chris White and what drives you and what motivates you. So what I'm learning so far, and our listeners are learning, use resources. Hire a business coach, hire a publishing coach, because you don't necessarily need to go it alone. There are other people that are doing it already and doing things well, just like what you are sharing in your book. There was enough value in there. You're doing something well. You didn't like a job. You switched into the sales engineering role. You started doing really well with it. You started teaching other people. You started leading people. And all of a sudden you're like, well, I have something there. Let me write a book. Chris, did you have to get approval? Because you were working for someone when you wrote it, correct? Did you need to get approval?
I did. So it's a great question. I did not. And as it turns out, I was working on the book. I ended up, and I had some things happening in my life. My dad had passed in 2017, and I had some other things going on in my life. I was actually making a career change or a job change about the time I started writing the book. And when I started a new job, I published the book shortly thereafter. And so I told my employer, but my new employer, just so you know, I'm publishing that. They thought it was great. They were pretty impressed by that, and they thought it was great. And there's another point that I think is important to sort of bring to the surface. I'm going to say for about a decade, Bart, I felt like I had something like this in me. Because I had seen other people doing what I'm doing now, which is running a business, doing sales training and speaking at events. And I felt like I had that skill and aptitude and ability and message. I just didn't know how to get there.
Yeah.
And in fact, at one stage in my progression, I actually invested in a franchise, like a business coaching franchise, that proved to be nothing but an enormous loss of money and time. And the reason I did it was because I thought, well, I'm never going to be able to do this myself. So if I just invest in a franchise, maybe it was, well, and it was also a lesson in what not to do. But here's the key point. Even though it took me about a decade to realize this dream, I never let go of that hope, that I had that burning desire in my belly that I could have ignored or I could have let go of, but I refused to. And it took me a long time to get there, a number of different jobs and a number of different attempts, but I never gave up on that hope. And I think that's ultimately what drove me to finally publishing the book and launching the business.
Yeah. Okay, Chris, that drive, that hope, what did you view it as? Were you getting out of a bad situation in which you were getting beat up every single day? The stress was unbearable. You weren't getting credit. Was it a negative situation? Or did you just have this hope that I want to do it? I want to start my own business. Can you share?
I'm glad you asked. And it's definitely the latter. It was definitely a hope. And Bart, here's what it was. I saw people making a living teaching, speaking, running workshops, facilitating workshops, and making a good living at that. And I found myself just thinking over and over, if somebody can make a living doing that, I know I can. I know I have the skills. I know I have the desire. I want to do it. I have the ability to do it. And I know there's a need in the market. That's the other thing about the sales engineer role. If you were to look up books for sales engineer, technical sales, there's about 10 or 12, right? If you look at books on selling, there's thousands, right?
Yeah.
The sales engineer role, that role in the go-to-market team has been honestly ignored for decades. And so there was a need. I knew there were people out there doing it. I knew I could do it. So that's what it was. It was a calling that I felt like I had. It was to a certain degree fulfilling a purpose. Yes. And I was just unwilling to give up on that dream.
Yeah. And Chris, was it ever about the money?
Not really.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, the financial rewards of doing what I've done have frankly been significant, but it was never about the money. In fact, it's funny. Bart, I remember and I'll never forget for as long as I live, the day I published the book, my publisher said you should have a book publishing event. I managed to gather about 30 people in an event venue here in Leesburg, Virginia. And it was family, a couple of I have a high school buddy who he and his wife drove up from Richmond, and a few former colleagues. And I did it on I did a Facebook Live, and my mom was on Facebook Live. Nobody knew me from Adam. You know what I mean? And I
Mhm.
remember lying in bed that night saying, just before my wife and I went to bed, I remember saying to her, what, like, can you imagine if like this actually takes off? Like, I had no idea what to expect, Bart, but
Mhm.
just the satisfaction of having written the book, the satisfaction of taking basically a decade of ideas that just needed an outlet and
Mhm.
getting the, and you probably experienced this when you wrote your book. I sort of felt like I gave birth to just a collection of thought. And
Yes.
when I got it on paper and published it, it's almost like it freed up my mind to
Mhm.
begin to think about other things.
Wow.
So it wasn't about the money. It was about just getting my thoughts on paper.
Which is tremendous. And I'm listening again to your words, and our listeners also learning. You were talking about people can make a living from it. You'd never mentioned in the description that you were going to be financially free or financially successful. You were always talking about, I could also do this and I could be able to make a living. And I think that that's really important. So when you are fulfilling your purpose, then things are naturally going to come to you. And it's not about money or finances, it is about wealth and abundance. When you mentioned, Chris, about putting the ideas down and then it freed you up to do other things and to think differently, be even more creative, it's the same thing like a to-do list or a should-do list. And you probably know this as well, that if I read a study, and I share this when I present, 60,000 thoughts a day the average person has,
Mm,
something to the effect of like 90% of them are repetitive and 85% of them are negative. Well, to get rid of those repetitive thoughts, if you know that you wrote them down somewhere, then your subconscious is not going to bring it up to your conscious to think repetitively, did I take out the trash? Because I know it's written down somewhere. And you probably know these studies as well. It's really cool. I've never heard anyone explain that process of writing a book. It got your ideas down so they didn't need to be repetitive. It freed up your mind, it freed up your cup to fill it with something else, which is exactly what you're doing. It's so great to hear the story along these lines. um, the drive, okay, the dream, the
mhm,
not quit attitude, did that come from childhood? Did that come from your parents? Was anyone that you were close to, were they an entrepreneur? So what was the drive? Why was the drive? Did
mm,
you see something that a business owner had that you wanted?
mm.
I know there's 18 questions built
Yeah,
into that one, Chris, but
if this were a sales conversation, I'd be saying something like, "Now, there's a number of questions baked into that one question. Let me see if I can pick them apart." Bart, I was thinking about this actually before our conversation, and there's a few people and a few thoughts that come to mind. First of all, I feel like I have to give my parents and my dad a great deal of credit. And I wrote this in the book. My dad passed a couple years before the book was published, and in fact, I published on the day of his birthday, June 21st. And I said, Dad, I think you'd be proud. You always told me work hard and play hard. I
Mhm.
think I know I've played hard. I think I've also worked hard a little bit. But I was raised in the church. We were raised Methodist, so I certainly think there's a certain grounding in a faith there for me.
Mhm.
And I feel like I've had the fortunate of being exposed to a number of motivational speakers, motivational leaders. Zig Ziglar comes to mind.
Mhm.
There was a period in my life, probably in my early to mid 20s, where I felt like Zig Ziglar's voice on a little tape recorder was one of my best friends.
Wow.
you
Wow.
know, and people like Stephen Covey, and it's probably no shocker.
Mhm.
Of course, he wrote the book, The Seven
Yeah.
Habits of Highly Effective People. And by the way, I literally went and talked to a lawyer to make sure that publishing a book called The Six Habits of Highly Effective Sales Engineers wasn't going to get me into trouble. He said,
Mhm.
look, Stephen Covey doesn't have a trademark on the words habits or effective. So you're good. Um, I think it's just that. I think the influence from my parents, the influence of leaders in the church, I went to a Catholic high school, even though I'm not Catholic. So I think there was certainly a spiritual and faith influence there. And I've just had the benefit of being encouraged by voices like Zig Ziglar and others. And you mentioned the coach, the gentleman who, and I have to give credit where credit is due. His name is Anthony Spatafor. He runs a business called Pathfinders Career Design. He's still in business. In fact, he attended. He was the gentleman who I worked with, the career counselor that I worked with 15 years into my career. He attended the book launch, a number of years later, and in fact, even wrote a blurb in the beginning of the book. But one of the things that he said to me has never left me. And he said, Chris, there are so many people, particularly mid-career, who find themselves in a career because they happen to find something that they could do, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's what they should do. And here's the analogy he gave. He said, cats can climb trees, but squirrels live in them. So are you a cat in the tree, or are you a squirrel in the tree?
Love it.
And that just echoed. And he and I first met back in 2005, so almost 20 years ago. Those words have echoed in my mind just literally thousands of times. And I always wanted to find myself being the squirrel in the tree and just doing, and this is what he said. What would you do whether you were being paid or not? And the answer is, frankly, what I'm doing now. I love talking. I love communicating. I love working with teams. I love coaching and teaching and instructing and facilitating, whether I'm paid to do it or not. So I'm not even sure I remember what question I was answering, but that's where I went.
No, that just talks about your drive. Your drive was to fulfill your destiny. You felt that this was something that you had inside of you. A friend of mine from years ago when we lived in California found a book, and the book was called There's a Story Inside of You. And he bought it for me. This was Robert Susswine, shout out, still lives in California. This was probably 30 years ago, but he knew that I had ideas that I needed to put down on paper. And that was part of my destiny. And you and I have so many similarities. My father passed, but fortunately he was able to see the book before he passed. And even though he was having difficulty with dementia and lucidity, he was able to speak very clearly whenever he read something out loud. So he might mumble and stutter when he was talking to me, but when he read a page, it was as clear as you and I are having the conversation. I'm proud that he was able to read a few pages before he passed, and that's part of the legacy. So you and I, again, very, very similar. Starting a business, and I'm sorry that your dad did not get to see it, but I know he's proud of you.
But again, it's part of the journey, right?
Yeah. Starting a business during COVID, same thing. I had a heart attack in November of 2019. Company that I was working for, hospitality company, was going through some changes. I wrote the book 10 years ago, and it started getting organically more and more popular. People were asking me to take time off to speak on the topic, and I would do so. And then when most of my team was losing their job because of the pandemic, I had to make a decision. I want to, and this is not about me, but there's a lot of similarities, Chris, which I'm appreciative of your journey as well. When you made the leap, you wrote the book and you made the leap. Tell us about how you were feeling at the time and how your family was feeling at the time, how your wife was feeling at the time.
I'm glad you asked that. And I was reflecting on the last question about who influenced me. And it would be a gross oversight to exclude the conversation that my wife and I had even before I hired the gentleman, the book publisher. He and I had one conversation, and to his credit, he was a pretty good sales professional himself. And I was pretty convinced after one call that this was something I need to do. And by the way, just for the benefit of those listening, one of the things he said to me was very early on in our first conversation, Chris, what would it mean to you to publish a book? Imagine the book is published. What does that mean to your life? And what does that mean to your career?
Mm.
And my response was, it would mean everything. It would mean the world to me. And so the large 4-digit check that I had to write to hire him all of a sudden didn't seem so large. But I knew I couldn't write that check without my wife completely and totally being on board.
Right.
So a few weeks later, we agree. I said, would you be willing to have a conversation with my wife? He said, of course. We were literally on vacation. It was spring break. We were on vacation in San Clemente visiting friends. I remember we took a call at 9 o'clock from the queen bed that we were, sleeping on in their guest bedroom upstairs. And she asked a lot. She had a lot of questions, and he answered them all. And then we hung up, and she looked at me and she said, you have to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And part of it was, I don't want to hear you complaining about not being happy anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But part of it was,
Yeah.
I know you, I've seen you in action.
Mm-hmm.
I know you can do this. You need to do this.
You need to do this.
And then when I launched the business, the exact same thing. She said, I don't know what's going to happen. And we did our due diligence. Being very transparent, we had about 6 months of expenses
Runway.
We had a 6-month runway, and she has a very good job, and she has health benefits.
Yep.
And she said, again, you have to do, I believe in you. You have to do this. I know you will succeed. Yeah. And with that tailwind, knowing that I had the person that I love the most encouraging me and carrying us, so to speak, it really felt like I couldn't fail. Now, you asked how I felt. Was I nervous? Heck yeah. Was I scared? I still am to this day. I've been doing this for 4.5 years, and I still don't take anything for granted. Mm-hmm. But I've never been more sure of what I was. I finally got to that point in my life, Bart, that I know I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing, regardless of what the income is.
Yes.
And there's no better feeling than that.
You are the squirrel in the tree. And it was not easy to scurry up there. It wasn't easy to find the right set of branches, but you had favorable conditions, didn't you? And that's the solid foundation of your wife. And again, Chris, we'll have some conversations offline, but my wife is the exact same way. She has been helping me full time because my business is growing so much the last 3 months. And she's just like, there's nothing, everything is good. There's nothing negative. There's no criticism after you present. There's only praise. You're only hearing great things. Bart, you need to continue doing this. Well, what about this? And what about this? And what about a newsletter sponsorship? And let me reach out to these people and let me post for you. It is unbelievable. And I think we can both kind of use that analogy of they are not necessarily the rock, but they are that tree, aren't they? They are the foundational tree with deep roots, and they are providing the tree, the home for you and me to be able to build that nest and be that squirrel in the tree. I don't know if any of that is making sense, but I'm visualizing. It's making me feel good.
Yeah.
Chris, just a few additional questions. I didn't want to interrupt that thought, but I have just 2 more questions for you. You're agreeing?
No, fire away. I'm good.
Okay. All right, good. What you now know, and again, thank you for sharing your story with us. A lot of different lessons, a lot of different examples. People should not be afraid to do what they feel that they are destined to do. If they're working for the right reasons, with the right intentions and the right purpose, the abundance is going to come. The positive feelings are going to come. The creativity will flow, and you will be able to fulfill your destiny. That's what I'm learning from you. Chris, more of a technical question from a sales lens. As an example, I'm doing some sales training for a hotel company in 2 weeks, and then again in a few other weeks. So there's 3 or 4 different cohorts in which I'll be leading. I will share my hospitality experience, what I have seen to be the best of the best from a sales lens and the characteristics. But what are some traits that you have seen that are in the best salespeople that you've ever seen?
So I'm gonna focus on the word traits because
Mhm.
that was the word you used in your question.
Mhm.
There's a term, I work with an organization called Aslan Training and Development, or
Mhm.
Aslan Sales Training, I think we call ourselves now. We have a term called other-centered selling or other-centeredness. And
Yes.
the best way to think of other-centered selling, it's the opposite of self-centered selling.
Mhm.
And so the first trait that I'm going to share and lean on is the ability to simply put others first. Whether we're talking to prospects, whether we're talking to customers, and we have this sort of little game that we play. We have a picture of a compass, and I invite people to complete the sentence. The compass works because it always blank blank. What do you suppose the answer is? The compass works because it always
Points north.
points north, right?
Mhm.
We all have a compass right here lodged in our psyche. And
Mhm.
where does our compass point? To self.
Mhm.
It doesn't mean we're bad people. It just means it's human nature. If you and I were to go on vacation together and take a bunch of pictures, when you and I were sifting through the pictures, only the ones that we were in would we
Mhm.
take the most interest in. And when we see a picture that we're in, who do we look for first?
Yeah.
Ourselves, right?
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
just our compass at work. Our compass naturally points to self. It's human nature. So every time we're entering a meeting, in fact, Bart, I did this about 2 or 3 minutes before I joined your podcast.
Mhm.
I took 15, 20, 30 seconds to remind myself, Chris, this is not about you or promoting yourself. This is about Bart and serving him and serving his community.
Mm.
Make that reset your compass to the people you're talking to. Consciously reset your compass to the people that you're dealing with, and that will naturally come through. Motive is transparent.
Yes.
So if you make and by the way, do I get this right every time? Of course not, because I'm no more human or less human than anybody else, right?
Mhm.
But the
Mhm.
more I remind myself to reset my compass and be other centered,
Yes.
the more successful and satisfied I am. So that's the first. You asked traits. That's, to
Mhm.
me, that's the cornerstone, is being other centered.
Mhm. Outstanding. Outstanding. So many similarities again, Chris. I'm going to share with you what I talk about. I share in other shoes strategy. It's kind of a mouthful, but it
Other
is.
shoe strategy.
Yeah, and I have an image of a whole bunch of other shoes with mixed max shoes and different people wearing them, but it's an other shoes strategy, meaning what is it like to walk in your shoes, not my shoes. And then the other line that I use, and my friend Jim Hadley helped me come up with this. It is called erase you, and I
Mm,
have an image of a person and an eraser, right, drawing a face and then just erasing it. Erase you.
yeah.
This conversation is not about me. And I know I'm inserting a little bit about me just as normal conversations that have similarities, but this conversation is about Chris White. It's not about me. And if I am in a place, if I'm in a coffee shop, I am focused in on what everyone else is doing and how can I help them.
Yeah.
If I'm not focused on my computer, I'm looking to see who else can I help and how.
Yeah.
Was there water spilled on the table? Did someone leave extra crumbs? Was a toddler approaching the door to go outside on a very busy street? No one else was standing up, so I better.
Mm,
Those are the types of things when we erase us, we are behind the camera. We're not the director. We're not directing. We're observing and we're anticipating and we're over delivering. I love that thought process, Chris. This conversation could certainly go on for hours. I know I had two questions for you, but the last question is going to be about, okay, I want people, now that we know more about Chris White, CEO of TechSalesAdvisors, we know about your #1 Amazon best-selling book. How can people learn more about you and connect with you? Because I do want our listeners to support you if there is a need. How can
yeah.
they learn more about you, Chris White?
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking, Bart. Of course, people can reach out to me on LinkedIn. Chris White's a pretty common name. So if you look up Chris White and 6 Habits, you should be able to find me. Tech Sales, in fact, TechSalesAdvisors has now morphed into Tech Sales Mastery. I actually joined forces with a gentleman who used to run a company called Pre-Sales Mastery. So TechSalesAdvisors plus Pre-Sales Mastery is now Tech Sales Mastery. So you can go to TechSalesMastery.com. And of course, if you're interested in the book, it's available on Amazon, The 6 Habits of Highly Effective Sales Engineers.
Yeah, Chris, thank you so much for sharing your story. Congratulations on your success. I love that you're seeing abundance. I love that you fulfilled your destiny, that you're doing what most people don't. And you are that squirrel in that tree. You're not the cat that's going to climb up. You have found your home. And thank goodness, because you continue to help so many people, teaching people, educating people, and setting a lovely example. Chris White, CEO, Tech Sales Advisors, thank you so much for being a guest on the Most People Don't But You Do podcast. Can't wait to have more conversations with you, especially because we're local.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Bart.
All right. Thanks again, Chris.